Hi, everyone. Welcome to this a very exciting conversation with Nida Kirmani. Today, we are going to talk about gender identity and marginalization, as well as several other issues of cross-border research. Let me very briefly introduce our speaker. Nida Kirmani is currently an Associate Professor of Sociology at the Mushtaq Ahmad Gurmani School of Humanities and Social Sciences at the Lahore University of Management Sciences. She is also the Faculty Director of the Saida Wahid Gender Initiative. Nida has published widely on issues related to gender, Islam, women's movements, development, and urban studies in both India and Pakistan. Kirmani is a leading feminist public intellectual who has published widely in the academic domain as well, and her book, Questioning the Muslim Woman, Identity and Insecurity in an Urban Indian Locality, was published in 2013 by Routledge. Her current research focuses on urban violence, gender, and insecurity in the area of Lyari in Karachi. So in today's conversation, we are going to try and talk a little bit about her old as well as her new research. So thank you so much for giving us the time and welcome to this conversation, Nida.
Thank you so much, Rituparna. It's an honor to be here and to be able to speak to your audience. I just want to make a little correction. I'm no longer the director of the Saida Wahid Gender Initiative.
Okay.
And actually, I need to update the online profile because since then there's been two directors, Dr. Hadia Majid and Dr. Mariam Mustafa, and they've both done a great job. But I'm still part of the steering committee and very much involved in gender studies at our university.
Right. Thank you for making that correction. And let me, kickstart the conversation by asking you about the idea of the Muslim women, which is constructed in both the media and academic debates. We've seen this a lot in India and Pakistan, also in Iran. So how does the feminist movement understand the Muslim women?
Yeah, so I think you're referring to my earlier work that I did in my PhD, which later got published as a book as Questioning the Muslim Woman. So I did that research. Now it's been, this is going to tell you a little bit about how old I am, more than 2 decades. I did my field work in 2004, 2005 in Delhi. And I had initially planned on looking at the issue of Muslim women in all of India. And so this, when you start a PhD, you have these big plans and you want to ask, really big questions. And then when I visited, at that point, I was studying in the University of Manchester, and I didn't grow up in India or Pakistan. I grew up in the US. And so I was very ambitious about how much I could cover in my PhD. And then when I visited Delhi, which is where I was planning to conduct my research, I realized that even in Delhi alone, the diversity amongst Muslims is so great and the population is so large that one really needs to focus in on a particular area or community. And so I decided to work in an area called Zakir Nagar, which is near Jamia Millia Islamia University. It's a Muslim majority neighborhood. And I lived there for a year, and I kind of spent time with lots of women who are living in the area, talking about their experience of kind of double marginalization or triple marginalization or quadruple, depending on their class and caste position as well. So my intention was to challenge the idea that we can really talk about the Muslim woman as if there is one homogenous category of Muslim women in India. I mean, if the Muslim population of India, I think at that time was about 12%. And so that is a very significant number of women that you're trying to lump into one broad category. And so I wanted to move away from that and using an ethnographic approach to really contextualize how various women from different parts of the country, because we know that Delhi is a city of migrants. And so for Muslims as well, they've migrated from Bihar, from UP, from West Bengal, the whole country. And Zakir Nagar was wonderful in that way because it was kind of gave you a snapshot of, the diversity that's there amongst Muslims in India as a whole. But of course, it's a particular community near Jamia. So a lot of the folks who are living there have some connection with the university. Maybe their kids are studying there. Maybe they're working at the university. There is a kind of middle-class, educated population that's living there. So it provided a particular kind of snapshot of what it meant to be a Muslim woman, or the many things it meant to be a Muslim woman at that time. It was 2004, 2005. So at that time, as you know, the BJP was not in power at the center. They were in power in the state of Gujarat, and the Gujarat pogrom had happened in 2002. And so in 2004, when I was doing my fieldwork, 2005, it was still very much fresh in everyone's minds. So the insecurity that violence caused, not just in Gujarat, but all over the country for Muslims, was also very strongly felt in Zakir Nagar. So my work really was looking at what it meant to be marginalized because of your gender and because of your religious identity, and then to talk to women from different class and ethnic and caste positions brought in even more complexity and really helped me challenge the idea that we can talk about Muslim women as if they exist as one homogeneous group. But at the same time, Muslim women are framed as a category in academic and media discourse and political discourse as well. So that category has some salience, and it does affect the way that women experience their lives. So I'm not arguing that we should just stop using it altogether, but really understand what that category, what kind of impact that category has on actual women. How is it affecting them? How do they see it? How do they relate to it? So that's really what I was trying to do at that time. I think your question was, how are Muslim women framed? So the way that Muslim women are framed and have been since even before India and Pakistan and Bangladesh got independence from British colonial rule, the colonial state also, and the Orientalists that were employed by them, also put forward this idea of Muslim women being backwards, particularly oppressed, as a community that they needed to save. And this was part of the British civilizing mission. And so Muslim women, not just in South Asia, but also in the Middle East as well, were framed as a group that was in need of saving by, at that time, British colonizers. In the post-independence period, you see then different groups of indigenous men using a similar kind of discourse to justify their own political projects. So as the Hindu right became more powerful over the 20th century, and now we see how powerful that movement has become now in India, part of their strategy of claiming their authority and their right to rule the subcontinent, or at least the part of the subcontinent that is India, was to kind of frame Muslim women in a very similar way, that Muslim women are oppressed by these backwards and beastly Muslim men, and that it's our job to save these women from these men in their community. And so Muslim women were again used by the Hindutva project as a way of asserting their own power and authority over Muslims. So Muslim women, again, had become like a symbol in the discourse, and it was rare that you actually heard the voices of Muslim women themselves. So part of my intention with the project was to bring some of those voices to the fore through the ethnographic approach.
I was actually going to ask you about if there can be a homogeneous understanding of who a Muslim woman is, but you've already answered that. Let me ask you a different question from some of your other works in terms of how networks have emerged which advocate for Muslim women's rights. So how do they understand who a Muslim woman is and what she needs? If you could talk about it from your own work.
So there were two networks that I was studying. This was soon after I completed the PhD. So that was in 2007. So probably around 2008, 2009, I was looking at two groups. One was called the Muslim Women's Rights Network, and that was run by a woman named Hasina Khan. She was in Bombay at the time. She's still in Bombay, but I think the Muslim Women's Rights Network doesn't exist anymore. But I spent some time with them to talk about their approach, and they were arguing for a more kind of human rights-based approach to advocating for Muslim women's rights, and really saw themselves as being part of the wider, and I don't know if we can even say there's one feminist movement in India, but they really saw themselves as part of a broader feminist movement in India. And then I was looking also at the Bharatiya Muslim Mahila Andolan, the BMMA, and they still exist today. I have sometimes I follow their work and I see that they are holding events and making statements and publishing reports as well. And they were taking a slightly different approach than the Muslim Women's Rights Network at that time. And I still think that they, from what I understand, take this approach. But again, this is my work in this area is a little bit dated. So it would be better to ask them. But they were trying to work from within a religious framework to advocate for Muslim women's rights through Islam, arguing that Islam is a religion that provides a great deal of rights for women and does speak about equality. And they were emphasizing those egalitarian aspects of Islam in their own advocacy. Whereas the Muslim Women's Rights Network was a little bit more what we would call secular, which I know is a loaded term, but they were not working through a religious framework. So they had a slight difference in terms of their strategy. The BMMA survived, and they still, I think, are very much trying to use Islamic discourses as a way of advocating for Muslim women's rights. I don't think either of those networks would argue that there's one homogenous Muslim woman in India. And they're working on the ground in various parts of the country with diverse communities. But of course, you know, the experience of being a Muslim and a woman, there are some common threads that do bind women across India together, even if it's a diverse group.
Right. So could we look at a document like the Nikah-Nama as a means of protecting women's rights within a social institution like marriage? And if you could talk about it from your own work in Pakistan, I think, you know, our viewers would benefit.
Hi, sorry, I think it froze for a little bit. Are you there?
Oh, okay. So yeah, I'm assuming you missed my question.
I heard the part where you said you started talking about the Nikah-Nama, but if you just want to finish.
Right. Let me just repeat it. So I wanted to ask you if you could look at a document like the Nikah-Nama as a means of protecting women's rights within the framework of a social institution like marriage. If you could talk about it with using examples from your own work in Pakistan.
So the idea, so I did some research on whether the Nikah-Nama has the potential to secure some rights for women within marriage, and whether women's rights advocates were using that as a strategy to protect women's rights. And that idea started in India, because the BMMA especially was using the Nikah-Nama or advocating for women to write their rights into their Nikah-Namas. And they were saying that, you know, this is a contract and should be treated as a legal contract, and women should, at the time of marriage or before marriage, make sure that whatever rights they would like to secure for themselves, they put that in the document so that they have some kind of legal protection later on. So they were doing that work, and I'm not sure to what extent that has been successful in India, but I know that that was a project that they had initiated. And that made me curious because I moved to Pakistan in 2011. And so in 2011, my research also shifted from being mostly about India to then gradually becoming mostly about Pakistan. So a lot of the things and the ideas that I was working on when I was still working in India, I was, you know, looking at how those applied in the Pakistani context. So even looking at the relationship between the women's movement and religion and Islam in particular, that question I also raised in the Pakistani context. I was comparing how the Indian women's movement and the Pakistani women's movement dealt differently with the question of Islam. And then I was also looking at how or whether the Nikah-Nama is used in a similar way by women's rights advocates in Pakistan. And what I found, this research I would have done around 2012 in Pakistan, in different parts of Punjab. In Pakistan, the context is quite different, obviously, as a Muslim majority country and a country that is, has a kind of Islamic form of government, whatever shape that takes, but the government proclaims itself to be working, within the confines of Islam. And when it comes to questions related to marriage and the family, of course, religion becomes even more kind of salient for the men in power. They seem to only remember religion when it comes to questions around gender and sexuality. So in Pakistan, we actually have, progressive is a strong word, but there are some protections that are there that women's rights advocates fought for. In 1961, the Muslim Family Law Ordinance was passed. And within that, there was a state-issued nikah that was kind of created and still exists. And so when one gets married here, you can register your marriage through using the state-issued nikah. Now, not still even in 2024, not everyone does that. Many marriages are not registered. But for those that are, going through the formal state initiated process, there is a nikah that you would get officially from the government. And within that nikah you have a clause which gives women the right to initiate divorce. That clause, I think, is called talaq tafwiz, I think it's called, and it's there. So you in the Indian context, a woman would have to write that in, and she would have to know that this is something that is provided for her within Islamic law. She would have to have that knowledge, and then she would have to make sure that that was included in her nikah nama. In Pakistan, it's already there. But what happens in Pakistan is that before the nikah nama even comes to the woman for her to sign, the nikah khwa, or the registrar, crosses out that clause. So women, at the time of marriage, it's a very stressful time for women, for everyone, and especially for the bride. And for her to then be reading this document, nobody even expects her to read that document. This is assuming she can read it all. We know much of the population is still illiterate as well. Assuming she can read, nobody would ever expect her or give her the space or time to actually carefully consider the document that she's signing. She has to keep her head down. She has to be shy and, look very modest and all of that. And so for her to ask a question about why is this clause crossed out would be considered, a complete unacceptable kind of behavior. So many women do not, I would say most women do not have that right. It's almost like, the nikah registrar or wherever these documents are being printed, they just automatically cross out the clause before it gets to the woman. And men don't know about it either. Like there's just, so the document's there. And there's also space to add your own clauses. So for example, if you wanted to make sure that nobody stopped you from working outside of the home after marriage or pursuing your education or whatever you wanted to do, you could put it in there, but the vast majority of women don't know about it. Even women who are highly educated from the upper socioeconomic classes, they don't know about it. Even in our own family, one of my nieces mentioned that she brought it up with her family, with her uncles, and they got very angry with her for even having the discussion. And this is a highly educated family. So, it's there on paper, but it's still not there in practice. And some women's rights organizations at that time, specifically one called Shirkatgah, which is one of the biggest women's rights organizations in Pakistan, was trying to educate women about their legal rights within marriage. But I'm not sure to what extent that has made any kind of broad change in mindsets. I think the change is still very, very gradual. So for 1961 to 2024, we still have a very long way to go when it comes to women's rights within marriage.
Right. Thank you for that response. And to, come to your recent work, you have been working in the Lyari region. So I wanted to know from you how young men in these regions negotiate with urban conflicts. How do their identity come into the picture? And of course, if you want to talk a little bit about the area, the region, the field, that would also be helpful.
Yeah, sure. So just to give you some context about why I started working in this part of Karachi, called Lyari. So when I moved to Pakistan in 2011, I hadn't really done I had done small amount of research in Pakistan, but I hadn't done any deep ethnographic work here like I had been able to do in Zakir Nagar. And so I was kind of looking for another place that interested me and another project to really kind of sink my teeth into. And so I visited this part of Karachi in 2011 for the first time, or no, 2012 for the first time, Lyari. So Lyari is one of the oldest parts of Karachi. It's one of the original settlements in the city. And it is, the people there often refer to it as Karachi ki maa, the mother of Karachi, because, they see their area as the kind of birthplace of the city itself. It was there well before partition, well before even the British arrived on the subcontinent. It was a fishing village at that time. And then when the British developed the port, of course, for their own purposes, a lot of the labor that was being employed in the port, they were living in Lyari. So Lyari was always a kind of working class settlement, even before partition. And after partition as well, it continued in the same vein. So it had a huge working class population. Many of the people who were living there were somehow connected with fishing or with the port. So it's very close to the sea. And we know Karachi is a port city anyway. So I visited in 2012, and the reason I became interested was because the way that people were talking about their place, Lyari, a lot of the themes that they were mentioning, like the theme of feeling stigmatized in the city based on your identity and marginalized based on your identity, really resonated with what I had heard in Zakir Nagar. So my interest in urban marginalization and spatial segregation, which began in India, also I could see that applying within the context of Karachi as well. But the dynamics were very, very different. So the marginalization that I was witnessing in India was largely based on religion, class, and caste. Whereas in Pakistan and in Karachi, the marginalization that I was seeing in Lyari was based less on religion, because this is a Muslim majority area in a Muslim majority city. So religion wasn't the major issue there. The major issue would be marginalization based both on class and ethnicity. So about half of the population of Lyari is Baloch, or from the province of Balochistan, which, as you might know, is the most underdeveloped province in Pakistan. And so the people living in Lyari, even though they're very much Karachiites, many of their families have been living in Karachi for generations, some of them have also a connection with Balochistan. And Karachi, a city of 20 million people, only about 5% of the population is Baloch. So it's a very small minority within the context of the city as a whole. But in Lyari, which has a population about 1.5 million, about half of the population is Baloch. So a large number of the Baloch who are living in Karachi are living in this part of Karachi, in Lyari. Then there's a lot of other ethnic communities that are living in Lyari. It's extremely diverse and multi-ethnic place. So the next largest community is Kutchi. So they're originally from Kutch in Gujarat and would have migrated to what is now Pakistan before partition. And a lot of that community also has a similar class background. They were also somehow associated with working in the port or in fishing industry. So the communities there have a kind of similar experience of being economically marginalized. And the Kutchi community is an even smaller minority in Karachi. And then there's people from the rest of the country as well. It's also an extremely rich and diverse place. So I became really interested in that experience of marginalization and stigmatization that people in Lyari were facing. One of the reasons for that stigmatization was that this area has gone through many years, or had gone through at that point, many years of conflict. And the conflict was between law enforcement agencies, political parties, and criminal gangs. And a lot of those criminal gangs had connections with the state in some way. So with the ruling political party, which is the Pakistan People's Party in Sindh. And there were also rumors that the gangs were somehow connected with the army and the intelligence agencies as well. Now, all of these things are rumors, but there's also good reason to believe that they would have had some support from the state, because these gangs were in control of Lyari for several years. So from 2008 until about 2013, much of Lyari was ruled by these gangs. And these gangs it appeared to be that they were being given the green light from the provincial government and from even the central government and the army as well. So I was just fascinated by what was happening here and how, for average people living in this area, what did that mean for them? How did they experience the city? How did they experience insecurity and violence? What was their view of the gangs? What was their view of the state as well? And so I ended up spending many years just kind of doing ethnographic work there on various issues. And one of the issues that I was looking at, that I published a paper on early on, was on how young Baloch men were navigating the city in the context of this kind of violence and insecurity, and how, as men, we always assume that, men have free access to public space, and that they're, and certainly compared to women in all of South Asia, men have a lot more space to maneuver within the city, within public space. But in Lyari, what I was finding was that, especially for Baloch men, the city became extremely hostile for several years because, within their own areas, they felt insecure because of the gangs that were operating there and because of the law enforcement agencies. And outside of their area, they were being targeted by the rival political party at that time, which is the MQM, or the Muttahida Qawmi Movement. And so there was a great deal of insecurity for young Baloch men. This was around 2012, 2013, where they would actually have to take their sisters or their mothers or their daughters with them when they were traveling, because they felt so unsafe traveling on their own. So that's kind of what I was looking at that time. But the work is also, it's looked at various aspects of everyday life there. And I've also talked about how women negotiate that space and what it means for them. And so, yeah, it's not really new anymore. That's also old research. Now I'm pretty much wrapping it up. Last year I produced a documentary as well about it, about what life after conflict is like there. And so hopefully that research is now coming to a close. But it was very rewarding working in Lyari for sure.
Right. I wanted to also ask you something about the phenomena of disappearing people in Pakistan. And you do talk about it. And what role does social media play in this context, particularly Twitter?
Yeah, so that research is more recent. And I came to the question of enforced disappearances also through my research in Lyari. Because like I said, Lyari is about 50% Baloch. And so having so many friends from Balochistan, or who had a background in Balochistan, made me more aware of the kinds of human rights issues that were taking place in that province. And so I became, alongside my academic work, I also try to be active on various political and social issues. And so I have been regularly attending protests around the issue of enforced disappearances in Pakistan for many years. And that wasn't really my research interest. That was more just my, personal commitment to social justice. So I was, doing that for years. And I was also using social media, and still use social media a lot, to advocate around different issues related to human rights and women's rights and gender-related issues, and, you know, to critique the government and social structure, whatever. So I was using Twitter a lot myself, but I was never really looking at Twitter from an academic lens. I was just doing it and using it. And over the years, I ended up gathering quite a big following, and not really reflecting on what that meant, you know, how even thinking about how I was using it. So I was just, you know, I wanted to take a step back and really think about, you know, what this space is doing, what it means for me, but also for others, especially for the Baloch. Being the most marginalized ethnic group in Pakistan, how are they using this space? How do they see the space of social media as a way, as a place to advocate for their rights? And so I decided to focus in on the question of enforced disappearances. So enforced disappearances don't just affect the Baloch. There are thousands of people who are missing in Pakistan from across ethnic groups. And in fact, I think the largest number of missing people is from Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, and particularly from the area of Waziristan, near the border of Afghanistan. So when the government began launching operations there, this is during Musharraf's era, they started picking up and disappearing anyone who they suspected of being involved with the Taliban or with different Islamist groups in that region. So there are thousands of people who are still missing over there. And, you know, I also try to raise my voice, I mean, for anyone who's disappeared, regardless of, you know, whether they are involved in any criminal activity, or that's not the point. The point is that it is an unjust practice to disappear a person without any trial, without any formal procedure, and it's extremely cruel and inhumane. And it happens across ethnic groups, like I said, but the Baloch, considering that Balochistan being the largest in land mass or land area in Pakistan, actually has the smallest population. So the Baloch are relatively they're a minority in Pakistan, but the number of people who are missing is very disproportionate to their own population size. So people, you know, are disappeared in the thousands in Balochistan. And people have been raising their voice against this practice since the at least since 2004, 2005, when the practice started increasing also in Balochistan. So in Balochistan, there was a insurgency that began in 2005 after Nawab Akbar Bukti was killed by Musharraf. And there's been several insurgencies in Balochistan. So the kind of latest insurgency, let's say, began way back at that time. And so the number of enforced disappearances also increased during that time, and the number of people who were picked up and whose bodies were found later on tortured in mass graves. So there have been horrendous human rights abuses that have taken place there. And the mainstream media is not allowed to cover this issue. It is a red line. And so in the mid 2000s, you could see there were some articles that were being published in Pakistan about this issue, but gradually there has been a kind of media blackout on any human rights issues in Balochistan, which has led a lot of people to use social media as a space to raise their issues and concerns and to advocate for their rights. And so I was seeing a lot of Baloch people using Twitter especially as a place for them to share the stories of their missing loved ones and to demand that the government return their loved ones and give them some answers and some justice for the horror that they've experienced. So that was why I began that research, because I was curious, because as a population that is extremely marginalized, and Balochistan has very poor internet connectivity, so it's surprising that this group of people would be so active on social media. But when I spoke to people, I realized that for them, for many people, this was their only lifeline. This was the only way they felt that they could have their voices heard. So social media became an extremely important space for them. And even right now, we're seeing there was a huge protest yesterday in Gwadar, the Baloch National Gathering. I think they called it the Baloch Raji Muchi. And they're saying there are about 20,000 people that were there, and the photos seem to, testify to that. There were thousands of people that were there. And it's not getting any coverage on the mainstream media, but social media is covered in protests and videos, and, so they are really, using this space as a way of demanding their rights. Despite the fact that in Pakistan, we have a VPN now for Twitter. We can't use Twitter without a VPN. The government basically banned Twitter, I think, after the last elections. And they're still extremely insecure about social media. They've started using the word digital terrorist because they're getting so much criticism on social media. So I hope that the space continues to exist because the state is very, very insecure about it. Because while they've managed to control mainstream media to a great extent, they're still having really a hard time controlling social media.
Yes, I think there are two sides of it. The governments have used social media, but at the same time, there are also many others using it as a counter. It's the same here as well. Yeah. Last question. You've grown up in the US, but you did a PhD in Manchester, if I'm not wrong. And, you've also worked as a researcher in both India and Pakistan. And I remember reading one of your chapters about navigating these field sites as an Indian and as a Pakistani researcher or as a British person in this book by Rashi Bhargava and Nachala Tandon. So I was just going to ask you about your own positionality, access to the field. How does it change when it comes to a geographical location? Do you see similarities or do you see any differences?
That's it. Yeah. So yeah, I wrote about I'm a strange one. So yeah, I was born in, I mean, we're all strange, I guess, in our own ways, but I was born in the US, like I said, and both of my parents were born in Lucknow. And so in 1947, my dad's family migrated to Karachi, and my mom's family did not migrate. So my mom grew up in Lucknow, and my dad grew up in Karachi. And then in the 70s, or in the late 60s, my dad migrated to the US, and 1972, my mother migrated after she got married, and we grew up in the US. I think we were told to identify as Pakistani, even though when I grew up, I realized that we're not just Pakistani, we're also Indian, and we're also, so I started identifying more, I think, with my Indian side, maybe as a kind of rebellion against that. The reason my mom tells me that she told us to say that we were Pakistani, because she thought that in the US, people would think that I was Hindu if I said that I was Indian. Later on when I grew up, I was like, well, A, I don't really care. And B, that's their problem. I am what I am. So, and I started feeling more attached to India because I spent time there after my undergraduate degree. I worked in Delhi for a year at a human rights organization, and I really just fell in love with India, and it was a different time as well. I think there was still a kind of dream of a secular India that existed at that time. And I really, kind of at that point believed in that project of secular India. And anyway, so I started identifying more with my Indian side. And then in 2011, I moved to Pakistan. And so gradually over the last 13 years, I have become more Pakistani because I've been living here. And so this is how people see me. And I also, of course, have an attachment to the people living here and to this place. And I haven't been able to come back to India since 2017 because they won't give me a visa. So it's kind of like India and I had a bit of a breakup, and I hope we can mend our relationship, but let's see what happens in the coming years if the relations between the two countries thaw. But it's a very different experience, I think, being a, South Asian kid in the US. being kind of a minority, but a model, part of a model minority in the US as well. So I can't say that I was, so oppressed because I was South Asian. But there were certain kind of stereotypes that came along with my background. Then moving to India after finishing my undergraduate degree, living there and, seeing the marginalization that people were experiencing as Muslims, and as that was growing at that time, and it's only grown since that time. So my experience of, my identity was very different in India, and the assumptions people had about the fact that you're a woman and you're Muslim, and so people would assume that you're from a very oppressive kind of family, and all sorts of stereotypes that were there. And then coming to Pakistan and again shifting, so now being member of a majority community. The Muslims are 97% of Pakistan, or somewhere in the 90s, but the vast majority. But being a woman here and facing gender-based discrimination and seeing all the other kinds of marginalization that I'm witnessing around me that are based on various factors, or the experience of religious minorities in Pakistan, Christians and Hindus and Ahmadis and Shias, like, religious discrimination is a huge issue in Pakistan, but the dynamics are very, very different. So, you're always, and as a sociologist, it just gives you something to think about all the time and to write about. And your own experience changing so much, the way the world is seeing you, and then the way you're presenting your work also shifts. So for example, if I talk about my research on Muslim women in India in the Pakistani context, many people get very, very happy. No, there's happy is a strange word, but it kind of reconfirms their idea that, oh, look, this is justification for Pakistan existing because look at how bad it is for Muslim women there. And then I'll say, well, no, because, the situation for women here is also very, very bad. And religious discrimination is also a huge issue here, but it can feed into a kind of nationalistic discourse in Pakistan, that work. Whereas in India, I feel like talking about that work is still very, very important, or even more important than it was when I did that PhD work, because discrimination for Muslims has become much worse over the last few decades. So, that's always changing. It's always changing depending on where you are. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it was a long answer. Yeah.
Yeah, it does. I mean, it's a lot of identity in the making, I guess, as well as a lot of adaptations. And yes, a lot of that with the researchers' identity in so many geographical regions. I found your responses very interesting, engaging, and I think that particularly if our young listeners, listen to you, they'll be able to sort of think about their fields, how to think about research ideas. So thank you so much for that, and it was
Thank
truly
you.
very, very, it was a great honor talking to you.
Thank you, Utpana. Thank you for inviting me.